Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for this virtual roundtable workshop today. My name is Zenobia Homan and I'm a research associate at the Centre for Science and Security Studies at King's College London. And I will chair this session together with my colleague Karl Dewey, who is another research associate at CSSS. And also here are our very valuable research assistants, Shunak and Etfa. The workshop is planned to last for an hour and a half. First, we'll introduce you to our excellent set of panelists who have yielded invaluable insights into the language of nuclear deterrence and prevailing areas of misunderstanding between India and Pakistan. To provide some context, we'll also briefly summarize our broader research project. And next, each panelist will speak for around 5 minutes to share their initial thoughts on this subject. Then we're going to put up discussion points, so there can be discussion between our panelists and also you, the audience. To aid the discussion, we've also prepared several areas of potential divergence, and panelists will be offered the first opportunity to speak using the raise hand function. And then if anyone else has comments to add, I will read those out from the Q&A box. You can leave your name and affiliation if you want to, or tick a box to make your contribution anonymous. As a reminder, comments made at this workshop are on the record and the discussion is being recorded and it will be available on the CSSS YouTube channel later. We will also be putting up a couple of polls. The polls are anonymous as well, so don't worry when voting. You are free to elaborate on your answers in the chat box as well. Just watch out whether you're writing to just the panelists or privately. Zoom has a couple of options. I am curious if the discussion changes anyone's mind. And this does tie in with another very important part of our Language of Deterrence project. We'll be sending out a survey after this roundtable event, not just your average feedback survey, but a survey to collect more data on how you all see the language of deterrence. So do fill it out if you can and share it amongst your networks, please. And of course, we welcome your feedback. This is a new format we're trying out here. So if you liked it or if you have any recommendations, then please let us know. And in addition, if there's any other topics you'd like to see covered, then please get in touch because I realize 90 minutes is far too short to say everything that can be said on this topic. So I would love to keep the discussion going elsewhere via email or Twitter or whichever you prefer.
Thank you, Zenobia, and for everyone for joining us today. This project began with a simple premise, which is that often we talk past each other, and that we may use the same words, but often that we attach different meanings to them, or that simply misfounded perceptions or assumptions can build upon each other and create further complications in understandings or expectations, particularly in times of high public emotion or pressure. To help us navigate through some of this, I'm very pleased to say we have 4 excellent panelists who are joining us here today. First to speak will be Dr. Rabia Akhtar, Director for the Centre for Security, Strategy and Policy Research, the CSSPR at the University of Lahore, Pakistan. In addition to her extensive writings on South Asian nuclear security and deterrence dynamics, including her book on The Blind Eye, the US Non-Proliferation Policy toward Pakistan from Ford to Clinton, she is also the editor of Pakistan Politico, Pakistan's first strategic and foreign affairs magazine. Dr. Akhtar is a member of the Prime Minister's Advisory Council on Foreign Affairs and is a non-resident senior fellow at the South Asia Center, Atlantic Council, Washington, DC. We're next joined by Dr. Adil Sultan. Dr. Sultan served as Pakistan's Strategic Plans Division for over 14 years, where he was Director of Arms Control and Disarmament, and later Director of Research and Analyses at the Policy Doctrine Strategy Branch. Between 2017 and 2019, Dr. Sultan was a visiting research fellow at the War Studies Department at King's College London, where he published a book titled Universalizing Nuclear Non-Proliferation Norms, a regional framework for the South Asian nuclear weapon states. Dr. Sultan is also the co-founder of a web portal, Strategic Foresight for Asia, which is the London-based platform publishing policy-relevant analyses and security-related issues. Third, I'm pleased to say we're joined by Dr. Manpreet Sethi, a senior fellow of the Indian Council of Social Science Research, affiliated with the Centre for Air Power Studies in New Delhi. Her work focuses on nuclear energy proliferation, exports controls, and disarmament. She's the author of Nuclear Strategy, India's March Towards Credible Deterrence, and editor of Nuclear Power in the Wake of Fukushima. She is a board member of the Asia Pacific Leadership Network for Nuclear Non-Proliferation and Disarmament. Apologies there. And finally, we have Ms. Rukmani Gupta. Ms. Gupta is a New Delhi-based defense and security analyst for the defense publishers Janes. She has over 15 years of experience in academia, think tanks, and in industry. Her work focuses on geopolitics, defense strategy, and military strategies in Asia. She was previously the associate editor of the India Quarterly Journal, published by Sage on behalf of the Indian Council of World Affairs, and her professional experience includes research at the Institute for Defense Studies and Analyses, New Delhi, as an associate fellow working on security issues related to China. Welcome, all of you. So we would like to invite each of our speakers to speak for 5 minutes around there for their introductory remarks on the topic of misperceptions in the region. Dr. Rabia, you are our first on our list, so the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Karl and Zenobia. Thank you so much for having me here as part of this brilliant project. On your first, point about misunderstanding on nuclear deterrence, I think in this respect, your project is really fascinating because it has helped me, think about these issues in a different light. So I would like to just make some brief points and not take more time because I'm here to learn from my fellow panelists as well. I broadly think that language might not be that different, but what it relays and the objectives that it sets out might be a bit different between India and Pakistan. For example, India's deterrence vis-a-vis China has different requirements to those against Pakistan. But then this entire process of strategic chain that is in place can raise a lot of ambiguities as to how each country needs to posture towards the other. Secondly, I think that the literature that has been written about Pakistan's nuclear behavior has bracketed Pakistan in a very different light as a country which they think is conventionally superior to India and therefore vulnerable to using nuclear weapons early on in a crisis and a conflict. And I think this perception about Pakistan was challenged in the latest Pulwama Balakot crisis. So in the absence of Pakistan's written or published nuclear doctrine, this literature paints Pakistan in a light which might have led India to believe that there is space for limited war under the nuclear umbrella. And the biggest misunderstanding I think both countries have is that stability-instability paradox works in their favor and they can explore each other's thresholds while there is strategic stability that maintains at the strategic level. This instability at the lower rung, at the subconventional, can be explored and escalation can be controlled. I'll just make two more points about misunderstanding. Number one point is about India's NFU, which Pakistan does not believe to be NFU. Don't believe that India will absorb a first strike from Pakistan and then retaliate. So this defensive nuclear doctrine enforces with massive retaliation doctrine, whereby both counter value, counter force targeting exists, is quite unbelievable. Secondly is, given India's trajectory, there is no minimal about India's nuclear modernization to ensure the credibility of its deterrence. So these are a couple of points that I think about, and I'm sure in the discussion that we'll have later in this session, we'll explore a bit more of it. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabia. Some great opening thoughts there. Next on our list, Adil, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Karl, and thank you, Zenobia, and good to see you all, and including the panelists, my fellow panelists. So in brief, if I say I concur with Dr. Rabia, so that would suffice, because whatever she has made the opening statement, I agree to that, except for a slight variation on strategic chain that she mentioned. I look at it as a different thing. This idea of a triangular relationship in South Asia involving China is a relatively new narrative that is being built for a specific purpose. Because if we see the history of nuclear proliferation in this region, and when these programs started, and when India started and Pakistan started, at that time, China was not a major consideration or security consideration for India. Yes, over a period of time, as India grows in size, its security orientation also changed, and China started to emerge as one of the major factors, but it was never the consideration once India embarked on its nuclear weapons program. And we all know it started in 50s. Even the 1974 test, which we know now was a nuclear weapon test, it was termed as peaceful nuclear explosion because it was difficult to justify India going nuclear using technology from civil using for the military purposes. So that is one point. The second point about once we talk about language of nuclear deterrence, as an outside observer and as an adversary, I see that there's lots of confusion amongst India's strategic enclave. And once I talk about strategic enclave, I am referring to the elite, decision-making elite, the military, the political leadership, and the scientific community. Because if we see from the very start, once this weapons program was conceived and during 1998, once India became nuclear weapon state, and the doctrinal position, the political leadership view these nuclear weapons or nuclear capability mainly as political weapons, not to be used. So that was a matter of prestige for them. The military, the Indian military has always been kept out of the decision making, so they continue to explore new doctrine for war fighting under a nuclear environment. And the third component, which is also very important, the scientific establishment in India, mainly led by Defense Research and Development Organization. If we see their trajectory, they continue to build solutions for unspecified threat, like from going to ICBMs and going to other avenues. So there is a disconnect amongst India's strategic enclave. And why it is important? Because the overall picture that comes from India, it indicates that there is a confusion or there is lack of understanding about how these weapons can play their role or in deterrence in conflict. And we saw that, like Dr. Rabia also mentioned during Pulwama crisis, how easily these nuclear weapons were or nuclear threats were hurled by Prime Minister Modi. Initially they denied, but then they acknowledged that yes, Prithvi dual-use missiles were being mobilized. So that's very dangerous because that substantiates my early conclusion that the political leadership, they have a different understanding, and likewise the military. So that from an adversary's point of view is quite troubling. So I think I'll leave it to this, and I'm sure there would be more follow-up discussion during your questions once we start. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Adil. And I think it's very interesting to explore perhaps the fact that strategic enclaves are not homogeneous, and they're not necessarily, there's a diversity there, which is worth digging into. But before we start our discussion and any questions, next I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. Manpreet Sethi. Dr. Sethi, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Karl, and thanks to the Center for Science and Security for having me in this conversation. And what I've heard from the two panelists up till now, I understand. I'm already beginning to be convinced that this kind of a conversation is just so important for all of us. So I have some brief comments that I want to make, starting with the language of deterrence itself, before coming to some of the misunderstandings. So nuclear deterrence, as we are all experts here and we understand, is a lot about perception management. And therefore, communication is a very important part of deterrence building. Rabia referred to the narrative that exists about Pakistan. And I was just thinking about the narrative that I hear about India all the time. So basically with deterrence, credibility is extremely important, and that credibility has to be conveyed through your capability and the resolve, which must be communicated for deterrence to be credible. Now, communication requires a language, and nuclear deterrence over the years has developed a lexicon of its own. Most of this has evolved in the US, given the prolific research and writing and the thinking that they have put into what is nuclear deterrence. But this emerged in the bipolar context. Now, other nuclear players have ended up adopting the same terminologies, but it can often mean something quite different in the context of different dyadic relations. And this is especially true of South Asia, where both India and Pakistan have watched, have studied, have internalized some of the Cold War nuclear deterrence experience, behavior, and the lessons have been adapted to the context in which India and Pakistan are living. But the language has also been taken in, and it can sometimes mean something very different. And a good example, I think, of that is, for instance, the use of the word tactical nuclear weapons in Pakistani writings and strategy, and massive retaliation in India's nuclear doctrine. Now, tactical nuclear weapons, as we understand from the Cold War, is a low-yield weapon to be used in the theater against a military target. And it should have delegated command and control for it to look credible. We don't see that in the case of how Pakistan has adopted the idea of tactical nuclear weapons, because there is no theater as such in the case of India and Pakistan, and where that weapon could be used. And we are assured again and again by Pakistan that there is no delegated command and control, that it is under centralized control, and therefore the worries that come with delegated command and control should not be there. Massive retaliation on the Indian side. Now, we've taken this terminology again from the Cold War period and how the US thought about massive retaliation. Now, while India is using that terminology, it is not essentially thinking about massive retaliation in the same lines. But this has not been explained. And that's why I said we are taking the language, putting it into our own context, but not providing enough explanation on how it is different from the baggage that we carry of the Cold War period. So in the case of India, massive retaliation may not be all that you have. That's why the credibility gap is seen between the use of tactical nuclear weapons and massive retaliation. But India's massive retaliation is coming from the idea that deterrence is by punishment. So you have to cause unacceptable damage to the other side. And that unacceptable damage is very easy to cause with a weapon of mass destruction like the nuclear weapon. So it doesn't have to be massive in terms of the numbers that we are talking about. So it's a different approach to massive retaliation, but not explained as such. So therefore, communication of the meaning of the language is extremely important in order to avoid the misperceptions. I would also say that amongst all the adversarial nuclear dyads that exist today, US-Russia, US-China, US-North Korea, India-China, India-Pakistan, it's only India and Pakistan who actually speak the same language. So it's the easiest for us to understand each other because we come from the same lineage of this understanding. For instance, in the US-China relationship, China often complains that US uses words which don't even exist in the Chinese language, including the word deterrence itself. But in the case of India and Pakistan, I would say we understand each other's language. In fact, perhaps we understand each other better than outsiders seem to understand what our language is about. What is important is, even if we have or speak the same language, we don't speak to each other often enough because of certain tensions that get created every now and then. And then when we speak to each other, there is a general tendency to dismiss it as usual rhetoric. Now, obviously, that rhetoric is building up from somewhere, from some facts. And the important thing is not to talk past each other, but to try and understand what the concerns on the other side are. And that's why I'm very happy that we are having this interaction. Just a couple of points on what Rabia said about no first use not being believable. The commitment or the seriousness of the commitment that India has to NFU has to be seen in the light of capability built up that the country is doing. The arsenal that you need for a credible first use strategy is very different from the arsenal you would build for a no first use strategy. And while it's become common habit everywhere to say that India is building a counter force capability, I don't see any such capability being built up. I don't see numbers of missiles going up. I don't see accuracy of missiles going up. I don't see other things happening which are necessary for building a credible first use. So therefore, while it's convenient to say that we don't believe, and I think it makes for good strategy on the Pakistani side to continue to say we don't believe in NFU, but I don't think that's really true. And lastly, China not being a consideration for India's security and that it's a new narrative. Well, this is certainly news to me, because when India tested in 1998, the letter that was sent out by the defense minister to the US put China as the major factor, as the major concern that India had on the security front. And this is not a new narrative. China's shadow has only gone on increasing over a period of time. Yes, Adil sir, it was perhaps not so much felt in 1964 when China tested for the first time, because one was not expecting a nuclear attack from China. But over a period of time, as China has helped Pakistan become nuclear, and there's been this encirclement that India senses, the feeling of China's nuclear shadow on India has only grown. And Galwan Valley incident last year has not helped in any way in lessening that sense of insecurity that India feels. So I'll stop here, and I look forward to a more interactive session later.
Thank you, Dr. Sethi. Some very interesting points there. I think we have the basis of a very good discussion. But before we do that, Rukmani, you are our fourth, last but not least. Some thoughts, your opening suggestions. The floor is yours.
Well, I think what I was going to say has changed a little bit in light of remarks by the other panelists. And being the last speaker means that much of what I wanted to say has been covered. However, I think it is important to remember, as Dr. Sethi just mentioned, the fact that a lot of the narrative being built around the nuclear relationship between India and Pakistan, or even the other relationships in Southern Asia, is being built from outside of the region. So this idea of communication and narrative building is not necessarily reflective of the latest research or discourse within the region. For instance, the issue of Galwan incident was mentioned, and during the standoff between India and China, there was a lot of focus on accidental escalation between these two countries, and much of this focus was coming from outside of the region. So was being talked about in the West that there would be accidental escalation, which completely, to my mind, disregarded not only the aims of this military standoff, but also ground realities insofar as where their military capabilities or nuclear capabilities are based, how they could be targeted, or what the command and control in each country is. So I think to avoid this kind of narrative building, which is adopted by researchers in South Asia, it is important to have a discussion between India and Pakistan one-on-one. On the issue of the topics of misunderstanding, I feel that having heard the opening remarks, they've actually increased a lot, because when I was first thinking about issues of misunderstanding, the assumption was that the two countries understand their declared positions or their allegedly declared positions as available in semi-official or track 2 dialogue, but this no longer seems to be the case. So why is it that Pakistan says it does not, or Pakistani researchers say that they do not believe the NFU? What in Indian actions has actually led them to think that India's NFU is not credible? If they actually believe that India's NFU cannot be depended upon, then do they prescribe to the idea that there is comprehensive strategic instability in South Asia at all times? So what are the understanding and the gap in understanding that is evident now, even within this panel, I would say requires greater dialogue. The idea that each country is lowering thresholds for nuclear escalation. But as a panelist also said, that there is no space to explore sub-nuclear escalation or conflict. And to my mind, that is absolutely not true. And the same example of Balakot can be utilized to demonstrate this, because even though that we had surgical strikes, this did not result in nuclear escalation. That could have possibly been foreseen perhaps from outside of the region, or the idea of accidental escalation and stuff. So I will limit my opening remarks to this, but I think what the panel has said essentially only reiterates the need for there to be greater dialogue between the two sides, rather than depending on narratives that are created from outside of the region.
Thank you, Rukmani. Some great thoughts there. And I think you're right. I mean, drawing upon what everyone has talked about, particularly the idea of narrative building, it strikes me that actually, in addition to the diversity within each country, so the strategic and the academic enclaves which debate within each country, we can talk differently perhaps between those enclaves and those communities, between each other, between India and Pakistan, but also the third understanding, which is the external understanding of the dynamics. And I think we live in a world of nuclear optimists or nuclear pessimists. And I think certainly a lot of the talk about escalation comes from that particular community. But we can talk about that in our great discussion next. So if I may, the next slide, we have a couple of questions which we would like to invite all panelists to express their thoughts on. Before we do this as well, I thank you again to the audience for joining us. And I'm sorry we have limited communications for the audience. So please do use the Q&A button if you have any particular questions. And Zenobia will ask those out. Thank you for your patience on those, especially if one is used to speaking at these sorts of events. We'll also be having a poll for these questions. So this will be another opportunity for you as audience members to help express and contribute to this discussion. We'll be calling those up now, but for our panelists, I'm going to stick initially for the initial speaking order, although if you would like to use the raise hand button as well, you can chip in that way as well. So I think for our first question, which I think hopefully reflects some of the diversity which we've seen here, is within the context is open source estimates suggest that both countries are increasing their nuclear arsenals and the means of their delivery. And I think this cuts to perhaps a cleavage, which is, does capability equal intent? And this appears to be one area of divergence we've spotted, but my question to the panelists and then to the audience is there an arms race between India and Pakistan? If so, how does it manifest and how is it evolving? Dr. Rabia, would you be so kind as to have first thoughts on this?
Sure, thank you so much, Karl. I think a very important question and something which is easily misunderstood about India and Pakistan context. I believe that there certainly is entanglement between India and Pakistan and their security dynamics, but I would neither call it an arms race, nor will I term it as strategic competition. I would want, I hope that my fellow panelists and those informed in the audience have read the 2012 Carnegie paper by Toby Dalton and Jocelyn Tandler. They've looked at the aggregate data of the two states' missile and nuclear developments, and they find that their programs are decoupled. Their data shows little correlation between how both countries have been conducting tests of various delivery vehicles. And I agree with the author's assertion that in addition to their testing patterns, the types and ranges of missiles both countries are developing makes it evident that their nuclear objectives are divergent, and they are following different security strategies that drive their nuclear development. So there is a race, yes, But is that race in relation to each other? No. It is a race to achieve and maintain credibility of their respective nuclear deterrence. And for Pakistan, that is vis-a-vis India. And for India, that is vis-a-vis China. And that's how I look at this whole dynamics of arms race. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Rabia. Dr. Sethi, perhaps I will throw this up to you. Did you have any thoughts on these? I think there are certain parallels to some comments you've thought there.
Yes, I have lots of thought on that, Karl. And roughly, I would agree with what Rabia said. From the Indian perspective, I don't think there is any arms race, either with Pakistan nor with China, I would say. Yes, capability buildup is taking place, but that is in keeping with India's own concept of the kind of nuclear arsenal to build in order to signal credible deterrence. So this activity is taking place at its own pace. And we don't see it necessarily responding to the capability of the other side. For instance, China's moves towards deployment of MIRVed missiles, where one missile is able to carry several warheads, or Pakistan's actions towards tactical nuclear weapons. Neither of those has, provoked it in doing anything goals that the country set for itself in terms of what is credible. And these were made clear for ourselves and for the others in the draft nuclear doctrine that was put out in August 1999, which is just a year and some months after we did weapons. As per the doctrine, bosses, it also spoke of the triad, and hence the move towards sea-based deterrence for India, given its policy of no first use, was well known from then onwards. And ongoing developments only conform to this, and they are part of normal technological progression. Lastly, I think while assessing technological developments and believing that there is an arms race of any kind, one needs to accord due attention to India's nuclear philosophy, which eschews the idea of a war fighting with nuclear weapons. So nuclear weapons are seen as a weapon of mass destruction, and therefore they are best suited as instruments of punishment, not of doing denial with the nuclear weapons. So there is no emphasis on counterforce capability, and this, I think, allows India to escape any kind of an arms race, despite whatever you see happening in the neighborhood.
Thank you, Dr. Sethi. Just to say, apologies, but I think the connection was a little bit bad. So we could hear you eventually, but a little was scrambled. If possible, would you like to turn your video off? I think that may help with some of the bandwidth. Thank you so much. And apologies there. Thank you. Adil, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I thought my internet connection is bad because I also couldn't hear Dr. Manpreet clearly. So on this question, I think I would say there's no arms race, but there is definitely a competition. And if we use the term arms race, I would state that India probably is racing on its own track all alone. So once we talk about India and Pakistan, and there's a common misperception, and most of the Western literature states that probably Pakistan has a number of nuclear weapons or delivery systems. But as Dr. Abe also mentioned, and I would also like to just point out to a few studies, it's not the case like this. Because if we see from since 1998, whatever studies came up, it talked about Pakistan having 10 numbers more than India. So that has been a very magic number of 10 has been very consistent throughout the period. One has to think about India started its nuclear program reprocessing facilities in 60s, and 1974 was a weapon test. So it was started much earlier than Pakistan. So how would it be possible that India would have less fissile material than Pakistan? So I just want to challenge that perception or a myth, which is generally prevalent in the Western literature. Everybody knows Pakistan's nuclear facilities, they are modest. And if you see the timeline also, it is not realistically possible that Pakistan would have a significant advantage over India. So that is one, but I leave it to debate this aspect. The second is about if we talk about the International Panel of Fissile Material, Belfer Center reports, the estimates that are given in those reports by the Western scholars, India has more weapon-grade plutonium and HEU than Pakistan. So the reason is given by our Indian scholars or friends is that they probably have the quantity, but there is no intent to transform that into a weapon system. So capability is there, intent can always change. I would also refer to ICANN report of, I think, 2020 international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons. I don't know whether how far their estimates are correct or not, but according to them, India is spending around $2.3 billion annually for developing and maintenance of its nuclear program, whereas Pakistan is spending around $1.1 billion annually. This is as per the ICANN report. So if we see these reports also, that means India at least has double the number of weapons, or maybe they're spending more on less number of weapons. It is up to them to explain. I have no idea about that. On delivery system, once we talk about, again, there is an interesting phenomena. India continues to explain to the rest of the international community that whatever they are doing it is against China. But if we see the missile trajectory, the number of tests, and the specification of those missiles, the majority of those missiles are only specific to Pakistan. And I'll refer to the NTI data, the Nuclear Threat Initiative report of March 2020, in which it states that India started testing in 1979, conducted more than 228 missile tests. 49% were short-range ballistic and cruise missiles, and that were Pakistan-specific, as I view, while only 7% with medium ranges that would have reached to China's mainland. So as per that NTI data. So rest of the 24% that India tested were more or less the satellite launch vehicle or ICBMs. Now, in comparison to India's these tests or 228 missile tests, the report states that Pakistan started testing in 1989, has conducted 98 tests, 26% are medium range that cover India's landmass, all others were short range cruise and ballistic missiles. So it also brings into question what India tries very hard to convince to the international community that their missile developments or China is a threat perception. So they are building against China. The missile test, the specifications do not correlate with their claims. So most of these missiles are specific to Pakistan. So thank you. I'll leave it here.
Thank you, Adil. Some firm contrast there. Rukmani, any thoughts on these?
So, Karl, I don't think there is an arms race between the two countries. And do stop me if there's an issue with bandwidth, because right now I could not hear you very clearly. But to say that, well, I'll take these issues in reverse order. So what Dr. Sultan said, that only a small percentage of India's missile systems are, intermediate range ballistic missiles, or they are unable to target China. Perhaps in 10 years, this ratio will change. After all, this is an accumulation of experience and technology. And so you don't start with ICBMs, obviously. And so maybe that is where India is building towards. And certainly, as Dr. Sethi had pointed out, this is very much a requirement, I would say, of a credible minimal deterrence, right? And this is also, I would say, similar to what Pakistan has espoused as far as its full spectrum deterrence is concerned. I mean, the pursuit of a sea-based missile or a sea-based deterrent can actually be seen as an example of an arms race, if you want to look at it in that perspective. But from another perspective, it is just part and parcel of full spectrum deterrence and what Pakistan thinks should be its minimum credible deterrence. So I don't think what each country is developing negates their stated or accepted posture. India does have two nuclear adversaries in China and in Pakistan. And I'm told my internet connection is unstable, so I will stop video.
Thank you.
So let me just finish this, Karl, here, that there is no arms race insofar as nobody is seeking parity with each other. India is not even seeking parity with China, but for its NFU to be acceptable and for it to follow credible minimal deterrence, it will seek a diversification and an upgradation of its delivery systems. And these will be able to tackle not just Pakistan, but also China. So there is nothing to say that SRBMs can only be used on one border or in one way. They can be utilized across the country's territory as and when they may be required. This requirement has not yet emerged on India's eastern border, but it may well in the future, nobody knows. So I would agree that there is no arms race and both countries are working within the parameters of their individual nuclear doctrines.
Thanks, Rukmani. And I think one element from this is clear is perhaps numbers themselves are not, don't tell the whole story. And perhaps the fact that both countries are working towards fulfilling pre-laid plans and are in the process of being built or being modernized in some cases may explain a lot. But here I would like to just go to our first poll. So Isabel, if you could load that, please. So really, this is for you, the audience, to chip in, and we're going to open it for a minute. So if, ladies and gentlemen, if you would like to please answer your poll. This is not a reflection or of an endorsement of any particular speaker or position, but really an opportunity for you yourselves to get your voices heard. Wonderful. So this is entirely unscientific, but as a straw poll, it would appear that most people in the audience do not think there is an arms race. So thank you very much, everyone there, for participating. And I think that's interesting, particularly in the context of larger numbers, although, as I say, numbers themselves do not tell the whole story. But for the interest of timekeeping, let's move on to the next discussion topic, and then we can.
Karl, if you will just allow me a 1 minute intervention, just to set some historical records straight. We've been talking about dispelling misperceptions. I don't want people to go with those misperceptions.
Absolutely. Thank you. Dr. Sethi, over to you.
Yeah, thanks so much for giving me this chance, and I'm sure others would want it too. But I just wanted to, clarify a couple of things that Dr. Adil had talked about. So if India's nuclear program goes back to the 1950s, how can the number of nuclear weapons be less? And the reason for that is because India's nuclear power program takes precedence over weapons till 1998. Despite China testing its nuclear weapon in 1964, India does not move towards nuclear weapons. So the arsenal buildup had not started, way back when you are referring to and the power program is such an important component for a large country like India, where the electricity requirement is what it is. Secondly, about this, on the one hand, you are referring, referring to being dismissive about some of the reports which come from outside on Pakistan being ahead of India. Frankly, it doesn't really matter whether you're 10 this side or 20 the other side. Nuclear weapons is not about numbers. But on the other hand, when it comes to certain figures that they quote about India, he takes them very seriously. So we find in 1979, I'm surprised I'm hearing this for the first time, that India had conducted some missile tests. Well, the integrated program for missile defense development started only in the mid-1980s. So there are no missile tests that are traced back to the 1970s. And I think, getting some of these historical facts right is important so that we don't add to the misperceptions about each other. Thank you, Karl.
No, thank you, Dr. Sethi. And certainly, one thing I've known from my experience looking at each country is that it's very technical, both in terms of the origins of the power programs and the evolution of the weapons programs out of those respective ones. Thank you so much. I think we have a quick question from Zenobia.
Yes, I did just receive a comment from someone as well, which I thought would be a nice way to wrap up this section. And apologies if I mispronounced, but Syed Ali Zia Jafri has said perhaps we need to reassess the term arms race when it comes to nuclear weapons. The nature of an arms race is in the conventional realm and may be very different than that in the nuclear. And counting is certainly not a requirement of an arms race in the nuclear domain. So we might have to think of a different term going forward.
Thank you, Zenobia, and thank you so much for that comment there. And certainly quality and quantity are different elements, which I think we'll get onto later. Just on the next topic of discussion and in interest of timekeeping, we both elements have certainly evolved from minimum deterrence, credible minimum deterrence, and now Pakistan has full spectrum deterrence in line with the policy of credible minimum deterrence, stated through various government documents, notably the 2003 summary of India's doctrine, and since 2017 articulations through Pakistan's IPSR. In light of this, and I think perhaps informed by the previous discussion, interesting to hear if from our panelists whether or not they still think the terminology of credible minimum deterrence is still useful in describing this, and whether or not, and again we've touched on this before, so whether or not Cold War models are useful for this. Rukmani, I can see your hand is up, so over to you as the first panelist here.
Right. I think the terms credible minimum deterrence and minimum credible deterrence are extremely convenient for each country. Nobody knows what they mean. There is no homogeneous view, even within the establishments of these two countries, what this could mean numerically. I think this is all informed by changing threat perception. And in that sense, it is useful because the way that the countries structure their response or the way that they envision the requirements of a nuclear conflict are dependent on their threat perceptions. And as these change, their requirements are incorporated within these ambiguous terms of minimum deterrence. I think an important issue related to the idea of full spectrum deterrence is this, of course, according to the literature, falls also within minimum credible deterrence. But one issue that can emerge is that if full spectrum deterrence means that Pakistan will be able to target, will be able to basically tackle any Indian target, counter value or counter force, could this actually lead to an arms race? Or could this lead to instability in the Indian context? So whether the terms are useful, they're useful for both countries because they give enough maneuverability for them to define their requirements the way that they want. Are Cold War models useful? I am not entirely sure. I think this was mentioned earlier as well, that adopting terminology from different scenarios comes with its own risks. So in the Soviet Union's context of escalate to de-escalate has been utilized also in the Pakistani context, in the India-Pakistan context multiple times by a lot of authors. But what does this mean? Is this going to inform that the appetite for risk is very high in the Pakistani establishment? Or is this going to be useful in mitigating escalation to the nuclear realm? That is something that I think we can discuss.
Thanks, Rukmani. And fortunately, Dr. Adil is here. Obviously, Adil, you're speaking in a personal capacity, but with your own experience here, how would you interpret this?
Yeah, thank you, Karl. I think this is very important and this needs to be clarified. And of course, I'm speaking in a personal capacity, otherwise I wouldn't be here. And earlier, I didn't want to respond to my fellow panelists because I think then we will enter into tit for tat kind of conversation and we will not move ahead. So I'll leave the previous comments and I'll focus on this question because need to move forward. On a minimum, it's not an abstract concept. It is a very much clearly defined concept, and all nuclear weapon states, they have their own understanding of how much minimum would be required to deter a specific threat. So in nuclear domain, of course, numbers do not matter, but in terms of, since it's a more of a psychological and the way you perceive threat and the way you want to deter your adversary, so those minimum are definitely quantified, but not in numbers. It is in the context of overall impact. So once we talk about credible minimum deterrence, so Pakistan's understanding is that we would build minimum, which would ensure credibility of our deterrence. So that is how we define credible minimum deterrence. And I also want to clarify that full spectrum deterrence, the notion of full spectrum deterrence, as has been generally misunderstood, it is not like this. It was introduced in 2011, once we introduced these Nasser short-range ballistic missiles. So the objective was that we have, what India was trying to do is to fight, to explore space, to fight a limited war under a nuclear overhang. So these short-range ballistic missiles were introduced to give that message that there is no space for even a limited war, hence the entire spectrum of threat is covered. Of course, it has been deliberately twisted by certain elements and of course for their own interest to project as if Pakistan is going full bore. It is going to develop all kinds of weapon systems. We cannot afford to do that. We don't require that one. And in nuclear, I would again say, you only do as much as is required. So that is the concept of full spectrum deterrence, the spectrum of threats that we saw. Because post 1998, strategic weapons or nuclear weapons, nuclearization, it precluded the possibility of war. But then India came up with this fancy doctrine of cold start to fight a limited war under a nuclear overhang. So as an adversary, you needed to come up with an option to give that message that there is no space for even a limited war, because between nuclear adversaries, even a limited war can quickly escalate to an all-out war, and possibility of nuclear exchange cannot be ruled out. So we should be very clear about this. So saying this, that probably the countries, even the nuclear establishment, they even don't know. I am critical about India's strategic enclave, but I don't think that they would be so ignorant about not looking at their requirements as per their threat perception and the way, and it is true for all other nuclear weapon states, including Pakistan. So I think this point should be very clear that we are, once we are talking, first of all, there is a broad consensus. The audience or the other participants also agree there is no arms race. So if there's no arms race, so this also supports that we are not building the way it is being perceived, the full spectrum deterrence. So I think this concept needs to be understood. It's the spectrum of threats that we want to deter, not the spectrum of capabilities, because then the other later part leads towards arms racing, and we are not doing arms race in this region. Thank you.
Thank you, Adil. Some very interesting comments there. And I can pick up a couple of themes, but certainly one which salient is perhaps the distinction between conflicts and war. If you're talking about limited war or limited conflict, perhaps for me at least, the distinction there would help disambiguate some of those. But before I do, Dr. Rabia, do you have any thoughts before I move on?
Absolutely, Karl. So I wish, both India and Pakistan would drop the word minimum from their doctrine so that this question is dropped from the menu for all time to come. I think it does not serve any utility or purpose. Instead, it adds to the confusion. So I understand the essence of it, but also the complexity. For example, for India, what's minimum to deter Pakistan is not credible to deter China. And what is credible for China is not minimum for Pakistan. And that's what Pakistan bases its calculations on. It's as simple as that. So Pakistan maintains that whatever its numbers are, they're still minimum that are needed to maintain the credibility of its deterrence towards India. But that minimum to me is relative. It is not a fixed number. So if the Indian numbers go up, Pakistani numbers are bound to go up. If India's policy is massive retaliation, How can massive be obtained with minimum? That's beyond me, even though Dr. Sethi, tried to refer to it. So let me say this. Whatever India has in its arsenal today is offensive nuclear capability, offensive nuclear forces hedged behind NFU. To the world, it might project their strategy as defensive against a wide range of threats, but to Pakistan, no such comfort is derived from that projection. So it doesn't matter whether India calls it credible minimum deterrence. To Pakistan, it is no short of strategic. So there is no non-aggressive or defensive sense of comfort here. That's where I would locate full spectrum deterrence philosophically, which in essence is credible minimum deterrence, but graduated to cover all levels of Indian aggression at the sub-conventional, conventional, and nuclear theaters. So you have a range of threat scenarios in all theaters, and you have the capability to deter at all levels. So to me, this full spectrum deterrence is a combination of conventional and nuclear deterrence capabilities. And your second question, I don't think Cold War models are applicable here because there was nothing minimal about that competition, which was in real essence of the word was competition and arms race. It was strategic deterrence between US and Soviet Union. A true arms race to achieve parity in numbers of warheads and delivery vehicles. I would also refer to, quid pro quo plus, which I again see as not a new doctrine post-Balakot. I see it again as a continuation of credible minimum deterrence and full spectrum deterrence. And all it has done is contextualize Pakistan's conventional response post-Balakot strikes by letting India know that conventional matching conventional is the first step. And the plus in it is leaving it to their imagination should India choose to escalate. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Rabia. I think we have a quick comment from Rukmani, but Dr. Sethi, if you would speak after that, if that's okay.
No, I just have a quick question.
Yes.
So actually an elaboration is what I was hoping for, since we are talking about the language of deterrence. And I would like to understand this better, especially the Pakistani perspective on this. How did they view the Balakot strikes as falling within full spectrum deterrence? And was this assessed as a success?
At which point, Rukmani, you've actually just preempted one of the future areas of discussion. So not all. So if you're very happy, I'd like to park that question until the appropriate slide, if that's okay.
Yes, we can do that.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. So Dr. Sethi, sorry about that. If you would like to have any elaborations on these questions.
Thank you, Karl. And if you'll allow me, I'll keep my video on close because I do keep getting these notifications saying the internet is unstable. And I'd rather be heard than be seen because this is an important issue.
Absolutely.
So normally I'm in agreement with Dr. Rabia on many things, but I don't think dropping minimum is a good idea for any of us. When India says credible minimum deterrence, it's with a purpose. It's not to give comfort to anyone, certainly not to the adversaries, and not to the international community either. It says minimum in order to define a certain philosophy for itself in what should be the guide to the buildup of the nuclear arsenal. So what India is suggesting, more to itself than to anyone else, I would say here is that you would build the least amount to cause unacceptable damage. And since causing such kind of a damage is not difficult with a weapon of mass destruction, given the densities of population that we have, which is why I say India's massive retaliation is not the US massive retaliation. It's not about numbers. It's about the massive damage that will happen, irrespective of how many numbers you're using, even at a very low scale, So the emphasis on minimum, as I understand in CMD, is coming from the understanding of establishing deterrence through the threat of punishment, not through the threat of fighting and prevailing in a war. And that was, the Cold War model that believed in maximalist accumulation of weapons so as to deter by showing that we can fight a nuclear war and win in that kind of a war. So this is what led to the kind of arsenal that we saw with the US and USSR of 60, 70,000 nuclear weapons. before the realization dawned that nuclear deterrence does not require such large numbers. I mean, we all know what happened in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It was one weapon on both Hiroshima and Nagasaki each, and we saw over 150,000 people vaporized within a minute. So therefore, based on this understanding, why I would say the Cold War model has been useful for us is in order to understand that you don't need that kind of an arsenal. And therefore, minimum is the philosophy which is guiding you in terms of what you would want to build and not overspend on a capability which is unlikely to come into use. So this is my understanding of why CMD remains an important philosophical guide for the arsenal buildup, particularly for India.
No, thank you, Dr. Sethi. And I know certainly the one thing we actually haven't really discussed in this idea of minimalism is perhaps the idea of survivability. We certainly see this in India's draft doctrine, and I think we see this perhaps in some of Pakistan's capabilities regarding its mobility and dispersal models. But I think one area of misunderstanding perhaps is that increasing numbers can be defensive if seen in terms of survivability. It's not just about that relative sense of what does it take. I think perhaps needs a bit of clarity, but I would like to say thank you all for your comments. I'm going to open up the next survey poll, please, Isabel. We're going to ask the audience. So thank you if you answered before. I'll just take you through these options. Is the term credible minimum deterrence still useful in describing each other's nuclear capabilities? I have a yes, there's a universal understanding, by which I kind of mean with the Cold War models. Yes, credible minimum deterrence is useful, but specific to the Southeast Asian context. Maybe, yes to India, not to Pakistan, reverse, but also not applicable to either. So hopefully those make sense. Certainly there may be ones of do they help for one, but not the other. So please just take the time to go through those.
I have one interesting comment from the audience as well, which is, can deterrence ever be half spectrum instead?
Thanks, Zenobia. Let's take that at the end perhaps, but I'm going to end polling here. And it's interesting, I think we have a clear spread. So with just over a quarter is the idea that perhaps it's not applicable to either. But actually there are a good spread between yes, it is useful in some contexts. So thank you everyone for that and the audience for your thoughts there. I'm aware we are over the hour now, so I would perhaps go on to the next question, which Rukmani preempted. The idea that Nasir to counter cold start doctrine, perceived cold start doctrine, we've seen surgical strikes by India and quid pro quo plus by Pakistan. Apologies. Wondering if there's confidence between the speakers, whether or not that these new form of limited conflict will remain limited, and perhaps given Rukmani's previous question, Adil, would you like to take the next step?
Yeah, sure. Okay. This question, I think again, I would refer to something which I stated at the once I said that there is disconnect between India's strategic enclave, the political leadership, the military, and the scientific. Now, these doctrines, if you see in that context, talking about surgical strikes between nuclear weapon states or taking punitive measure against another nuclear weapon states, we never heard these kind of things, but it came from India, and that's how. So that is a problematic. The conventional military in India, they are kept outside the nuclear decision making. Sorry. They're kept outside the nuclear decision making, and they probably do not fully grasp the complications or the issues related with this. Just give me 1 second. Sorry, apologies for that. Okay, so that's the problem. Now coming back to from where did it originate, these concepts of limited war? So we talked about Gold Star Doctrine, which was introduced by India in 2004, and Pakistan introducing short-range ballistic missiles to give that message that there is no space for limited war. So the thinking from the Indian side that started to come, because they could not capitalize on the conventional military advantage, how to take punitive measures against its adversaries. So they talked about, and one of the interesting points that often is overlooked, there's so much of focus on Pakistan's tactical nuclear weapon. We tested Nasser in April 2011. In July, India tested its Prahar short-range ballistic missiles. The Press Information Bureau press release, the title says tactical nuclear weapon capable of carrying different types of warheads. But subsequently, everyone denies that, no, that was not a tactical nuclear weapon. So what the point I want to bring out is, as a military, probably there was a thought on the Indian side also, since Pakistan has now brought it and the massive retaliation doctrine is being questioned, because what if Pakistan uses one of its short-range ballistic missiles to strengthen deterrence, to give message that there is no space for war? Should India retaliate massively? It cannot. And if it doesn't, its doctrine gets discredited. So they started thinking on this tit for tat kind of response, where with several of the Indian scholars themselves talked about this thing. And this is natural, because the professional militaries, they would continue, or they would explore these things. But what came out since 2011 till 2016, that India couldn't play with those doctrines. The Gold Star Doctrine still remains a paper tiger, one could say. So this 2016, a ground-based surgical strike that came up, this was a thinking probably given by the Indian military, that they can probably take some punitive measures against Pakistan and get away with this thing. And of course, Pakistan denied that there was no ground-based surgical strike, so it didn't respond. But what happened in 2019 was, there was evidence, there was this aerial surgical strike. And as part of what Dr. Rabia also explained, yes, full spectrum deterrence is a combination of conventional responses and nuclear. And this is not something new. If you go back to Pakistani writings and the statements by senior decision-making, we have always stated that this perception that in any conflict between India and Pakistan, nuclear weapons would immediately come into play, this was never the case. We had always said we have conventional responses, and like India does practice its Gold Star Doctrine, Pakistani military also continuously practiced every year the as-may-know exercises. So that was a message given, that we have credible conventional responses. So, but after Balakot, now this has become more prominent and people have started to take it more seriously. But this thinking was from the very start. It was never purely reliance on the nuclear capability or nuclear deterrence. We had conventional responses. So in Balakot again, emboldened and getting encouraged by Pakistan's lack of response in 2016, probably the Indian Air Force thought that they would be able to carry out a surgical strike and get away with this thing, and then they would use it for political means, as Prime Minister Modi did after 2016. On every other occasion, he would hurl a threat, or he would use that so-called surgical strike, because from Pakistani perspective, there was no ground-based surgical strike, but he would give that kind of message. This is how I would treat my neighbor. So 2019, he attempted, was humiliated. We saw the result, what happened. So India, despite having that conventional military advantage, having a larger air force, 2 of its aircraft were shot down. So this brings out a very clear lesson, that there's no space for even a limited conflict between 2 nuclear powers. And the way Prime Minister Modi reacted after that humiliation, because he had to satisfy its domestic constituency, that he is a strong nationalist leader and he can still punish Pakistan. So he used Hindi phrases or threatening Pakistan with a nuclear strike, signaling to launch missiles. It was more of a kind of to cover up his embarrassment. So the lesson, I think the Indian decision makers now, that lesson has been taken, that if ever India attempts, Pakistan, of course, will not stop. And as part of its full spectrum deterrence, it has this quid pro quo responses. That is, that the response would be, the conventional response will be with a premium, the way it happened in 2019. I think it has strengthened conventional deterrence. And of course, there was credible nuclear deterrence since we became nuclear weapon states. And that's why India could not operationalize its Gold Star doctrine. So the outcome is there is credible conventional and nuclear deterrence in this region. But if one of the leadership tries to exploit some space for a war, so there could be a possibility of quick escalation between two nuclear armed adversaries. And 2019, we were lucky that Pakistan did not retaliate or responded in words the way Prime Minister Modi wanted Pakistan to respond. We demonstrated restraint. Prime Minister Imran Khan is on record. So it didn't escalate, but you cannot guarantee that future leaders would be able to restrain themselves. So that's a dangerous part that we have to take into consideration. Thank you.
Thank you, Adil. I'm sure that will have provoked a lot of thoughts amongst our fellow panelists. So actually, I'm going to offer it first of all to Rukmani and ask, first of all, did that help answer your question?
I'm not sure that it did. I think partially in trying to understand how Pakistan views escalation or conflict escalation and what its responses to perceived conflict escalation would be. So in that context, it's helpful. But, you know, what happened with the surgical strikes and the fact that Indian aircraft was shot down and an Indian Air Force officer was captured, what can this be taken as evidence of quid pro quo plus? Like, this may or may not have happened. So to say, I would say that it is a good thing that we did not see escalation. But at the same time, I don't think this necessarily demonstrates either conventional superiority or the idea that India has accepted full spectrum deterrence as something that is going to deter reprisals in the future. So the other thing I wanted to actually highlight is the question actually talks about cold start and surgical strikes in a sort of continuation or an evolution. And I don't think that is true. First, it is questionable what kind of army doctrine actually exists, but the idea the cold start would be a land-based quick response to a provocation. First of all, I think it's useful to remember that cold start was only envisioned as a response. It wasn't envisioned necessarily as something that India would do in a scenario where there is peace. But also that surgical strikes don't have to be in response to anything. I mean, I may be adding ambiguity here, but surgical strikes can in the future be preemptive. And is this something that has been considered in Pakistan? I do not know. But also within India itself, there are scholars who have talked about how India could employ a quid pro quo plus response to Pakistan. So although we talk about massive retaliation and inflicting unacceptable damage need not be the aim of escalation or conflict for either country. So if nobody wants weapons of mass destruction annihilating billions of people, how do we respond to nuclear provocation at a threshold that is not massive? So I would say that quid pro quo plus is not necessarily only a Pakistani viewpoint, but there are scholars in India who have also looked at this, because at the end of the day, you do need to envision how conflict will end. So how do you move? How do you prevent further rounds of escalation? And okay, I'll stop here. I mean, I'm sure
thank you very much.
The other panelists have something to say.
Just to cut you off in the interest of time, I realise actually we've had an hour and 20, so we're very close to the end. So thank you all for, I mean, this is a fascinating discussion. I'm just going to pick up quickly, I think, the idea of Indian acceptance, which you mentioned. If I could go perhaps to Dr. Sethi first and then to Dr. Rabia for final comments before we go to the audience. But Dr. Sethi, do you have any thoughts perhaps on Indian acceptance of quid pro quo plus, or perhaps future responses to this cycle?
Yeah, thank you, Karl. In fact, I was quite fascinated, by the context that you have placed here on the slide, because what I find interesting is that you start with cold start as the head of the chain of strategies, and then you go down the path of these others. But we forget that cold start itself was arrived at as a response to continued use of cross-border terrorism. So I would put terrorism at the head of the strategies and then go down, what you've listed out here. I mean, if you recall, in December 2001, the Indian Parliament was subjected to a terrorist attack, which was traced back to Pakistan. And as a result, India had mobilized its army. But this was seen to take so much time that it gave Pakistan also time to mobilize its forces. And the country stayed in that military standoff for, the better part of 2002. And all that India got in return for that was a statement from President Musharraf saying that he would not allow his country to be used for future attacks of terrorism. But that has continued. I mean, those attacks have continued. So the cold start was conceived as a strategy that would enable quick mobilization for quick action against terrorist targets. And surgical strikes and air strikes have been conducted with great care and calibration to avoid any collateral damage. They have necessarily meant only attacking the terrorist targets across the border. So when conflict takes place, each side believes that it has a handle on it and that escalation can be managed. And in the past few incidents, well, that escalation has also been managed because, whether it was the 2008 Mumbai attack, when India did not resort to military action, or in the case of surgical strikes of 2016, when Pakistan refrained from responding by denying the action in the first place. Now, in 2019, when the terrorist strike on Indian paramilitary forces took place, India chose to respond with air strikes, but it was careful to keep the strikes extremely precise. And I think Pakistan also responded with its air force rather intelligently, not allowing escalation to happen. So they made a point, but nevertheless, very intelligently about how that point was made. And then, of course, we know the pilot was captured and returned and de-escalation happened. Now, these incidents have shown that propensity for risk-taking is high on both sides. And there is also a high awareness of the situation running out of control. And I would say the best way of getting out of any of this, what we are talking, this chain of strategies that you put down here, would be that no provocations are mounted in the first place from across the border, because the risks as we go down this chain of strategies matter to both of us. And I'll stop here.
Thank you, Dr. Sethi. Dr. Rabia, any thoughts on that before we go to our poll?
All right, thank you so much. Since you've talked about Nasser, I would like to say that, there is nothing tactical about a nuclear weapon. Irrespective of its tonnage and TNT value, its effects are going to be strategic. And also the retaliation, whether Pakistan uses it against India or India uses it against Pakistan. So those who call them battlefield weapons clearly think they'll be used to win some round of escalation. But there are no victories to be scored with the use of nuclear weapons. If you engage with Robert Jarvis's literature, he's skeptical about too in his writings. But there is a paradox when he says that strategy should be unambiguous and the credibility should be strong. So if these both were to serve as prerequisites, then how can this resolve be demonstrated in the absence of a strategy designed to win the war, thus strengthening deterrence in return? This takes me to US, which clearly buys the framework that nuclear wars are winnable and thus weapons are usable. Therefore, they are developing smaller yield battlefield nukes so that they lend credibility to their deterrence. I don't see how in South Asian context, India or Pakistan can get away with the use of nukes, tactical or strategic, and win the war rounds of escalation. So the presence and continued development of tactical nuclear weapons will continue to remind us of one thing, that limited nuclear war is a possibility. And as long as that possibility remains and states are okay with it, we will have problems with strategic stability, which already is fragile and then, continues to be an elusive dream. Some comments to Rukmani. I think she did manage to confuse me a bit by adopting QPQP as a possible Indian strategy as well, which I don't mind. I think nobody has put a stamp on it. But what does Pakistan want? Pakistan does not want escalation. No state wants escalation. So all strategies employed are employed so that next round of escalation does not happen. And the plus in this QPQ is exactly that. And it's not FSD. It still remains, a strategy. QPQ is not a new strategy. Like I said, it's an extension of FSD. And it is just to stop the next round of escalation. And P means whatever you might want to think is going to happen. And if for India to adopt QPQP, India will need to know what the plus is all about. India would need to know what the plus in Pakistan's book or playbook is going to be about for it to take place. Conventional superiority is not, I think either Rukmani mentioned it or Dr. Sethi, I think Rukmani did. Nobody is in the game of superiority here. It is not about numbers. And to answer your question, which is posed on the screen, is there confidence that these new forms of limited conflicts will remain limited? So no, there is zero confidence. I think India and Pakistan should not derive too much of a comfort from what happened in Balakot. Yes, there was a luck element. I, for one, have written that Pakistan should be credited for crisis termination. I think leadership played and was a very, very important variable for Pakistan. Release of pilot and choice of targets to show capability and resolve. Had that been any different, we would have seen different responses. But to take comfort and drive home comfort from this fact that, it is true for all times to come, I don't think that lesson should be learned. Thank you.
Thank
Karl,
you.
Sorry, can I just intervene just in under 30 seconds? So I think the first issue of conventional superiority, I was just reiterating what Dr. Adil had said about Pakistan being able to shoot down 2 Indian aircraft, and which was allegedly a demonstration that it was capable. And like you said, I think there was an element of luck on this, and we cannot depend on this. The second issue of India utilizing quid pro quo plus, this is within the umbrella of massive retaliation, as I said. So India would know what Pakistan has done, given that it adheres to NFU. So this is the Indian response. There has been some thought that it need not be massive. And to my mind, that is a good thing, because like you said, nobody wants there to be a nuclear war, which results in millions of lives being lost. The third point is, have all of these doctrines, have the surgical strikes actually led to the idea that there will be limitation of conflict? And as Rabia said, I don't think there is, we should derive overconfidence in the ability of both sides to manage conflict from this scenario. Because at the time of the Balakot strike, we know that there was also massive naval deployment by India, expecting escalation from the Pakistani side. So it wasn't as if leadership was blasé about this not leading to escalation, but all options had to be considered.
Thank you, Rukmani. I think that's a great point, perhaps to go to our poll here. So Isabel, is it possible to get the next question up, please? So we'll leave it for a minute so for our audience. Do you, the audience, think that new forms of limited conflict between the two countries would remain limited? I think we're seeing an interesting spread here, but I think most people here are quite pessimistic towards that. I'm going to stop polling there in the interest of time, because we are actually up to the allocated time. So if it's okay with you as speakers, I would like to overrun just a little bit, but not too much, if that's okay with you all.
Sure, that's fine with me.
Yeah, that's fine.
Thank you. I think from that debate, there is very low opinion perhaps that limited conflict would remain limited, and perhaps sharing some of the pessimism the panelists spoke of there. I think we actually had 2 questions left, but one on parity, and hopefully they actually we have seen a degree of preemption with these questions, and perhaps Rabia's last point about whether or not the idea that tactical weapons are, or the terms tactical or strategic, are useful, but also perhaps the idea that going back to non-state armed groups and Dr. Sethi's point there about their roles, I would like to just maybe have a quick discussion on this. I think it's perhaps a little more interesting than that, but really just the idea that we have numerous events, crises between India and Pakistan involving non-state armed groups. We see high emotions in these events on both sides, and there's an ongoing trust deficit as well. And I think the trust deficit will perhaps continue to amplify the impact on non-state armed groups. So Dr. Sethi, I think just picking up on your previous point, and perhaps if we could try and just remain quite quick for all speakers. But you mentioned this before, so I'd like to start with you, if that's okay. But do you think that during a crisis, and in this context, perhaps a non-state armed group, does public pressure drive escalation rather than restraint? Do politicians find themselves in a commitment trap? And again, we've just briefly touched on the lessons learned, and element of luck has come up in debate. But what are your thoughts on this?
Thank you, Karl. And this is a question that needed, a lot of time to discuss with everyone. But I would start by saying that India and Pakistan have seen multiple crises, not just since 1998, as you mentioned, but from 1947 onwards. And it was, not just the most recent one that involved the non-state armed group. From 1947, such groups have been used. So, and this is neither news nor is it a surprise, since many Pakistani military and political leaders have themselves acknowledged the use of terrorism against India. On the issue of public pressure, well, India is a vulnerable democracy, as you know, and in crisis, political parties, pressure groups, the press, 24/7 electronic media, social media, governments are driven by public opinion because they rely on them for their legitimacy. And therefore, public pressure becomes a factor during crisis situations. But the public pressure may not only drive escalation, it could also drive restraint or de-escalation, as we saw, with the capture and then the release of the Indian pilot, when the media was actually saying that we need to de-escalate now. Also, I want to say that governments must be able to insulate themselves from public pressure, especially when they are considering actions in the realm of national security. And we saw that happen with Prime Minister Manmohan Singh in 2008. Everybody, when the attack in Mumbai happened, people were asking, again, paying for blood. But he managed to, keep the government insulated from that pressure and opted for a different tack. Now, lessons from the latest episode. I think it's important to imbibe these lessons because we expect terrorism to continue and that we will end up in crisis again and again. Now, I think the lesson that I have learned, and I won't say India has learned, I mean, that's too big a thing to say for a democracy, but Balakot exposed the limits of the nuclear brinksmanship strategy of Pakistan. Not only did India demonstrate that there was room for conventional response, which has been countered again and again by both Dr. Rabia and Dr. Adil, that there is no space for conventional response. Well, as long as terrorism continues, India will have to find that space for response, because how else do you get the country to change its border, its policy of terrorism? So when this happened, uncharacteristically, India manipulated the risk of war for the first time, I would say. For instance, the Indian Navy put out a statement saying that there has been deployment of major vessels. India's military action was clearly meant to put pressure on Pakistan and to expose the non-usability of nuclear weapons. India was signaling that you cannot exploit the risk of escalation after having created a crisis, but that Pakistan must take accountability for having done this in the first place and share the responsibility for de-escalation. So this is one of the lessons about calling the nuclear bluff. Now, if India resorted to uncharacteristic behavior, so did Pakistan. It refrained from overt nuclear signaling, wanting to appear responsible and to deflect the negative attention that it was anyway getting after Pulwama. Pakistan chose not to overplay the nuclear card, and that was, in good spirit. Secondly, I think both sides have drawn the lesson that there are dangers which are inherent in the possibility of escalation, and this has been, signaled by both Rabia as well as Rukmani, that escalation is not something that you can take lightly. Thirdly, both countries face the challenge of having to face the expression of high emotions on social platforms, and therefore governments will have to find a way of how they control these and not get into the commitment trap, Karl, that you were mentioning. And fourthly, the need for back channels or direct crisis management mechanisms to find way of diffusing the crisis. Third parties have a role, but they can both heighten or reduce the crisis. So it would be best if the two sides could, find direct mechanisms of engaging with each other. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sethi. Dr. Rabia, do you have any thoughts on those? And if you do, I'm sorry to say, but if it'd be possible to keep them brief, that would be much appreciated.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I would differ a bit with Dr. Sethi here, because I think decision-making, be it of any kind related to nuclear weapons, doctrine, strategy, posture, it is not done in public domain, at least not in Pakistan. So it holds true for decision-making during crisis time as well. Rational leadership would never be swayed by public opinion, and I would want to have my firm faith in it. We are a very emotional nation. On both sides of the border, and listening to us as public during a crisis would short mean annihilate the enemy irrespective of consequences. So whatever happens in the social media domain or electronic media stays in that domain. During Pulwama Balakot crisis, the two publics, the digital soldiers of both India and Pakistan, they fought their wars while the leader was releasing the captured pilot. So I don't worry about what the media pressures or public opinions have on swaying leaders during crisis time. There are several lessons from Balakot. The first lesson, and I think first, comfort, but again, not to be drawn and not to be standardized, generalized, is that deterrence did not break down. It held, and conventional response was met with conventional response, unlike what the literature on Pakistan suggests, that it will go nuclear because it cannot respond to India conventionally. So that learning needs to be embedded, and the literature needs to be confronted on that. Pakistan does not get enough acknowledgement for crisis termination, and the measures it took at the height of the crisis, the resolve and capability that led to ensure that deterrence stayed its course. And secondly, since deterrence held, both India and Pakistan now need to work towards strengthening deterrent stability instead of introducing weapons and delivery systems that will dilute it or neutralize it. There were questions about AI and emerging technologies further complicating the security and strategic landscape, and both India and Pakistan going forward, whatever their motivations be, need to find ways to restrain engaging with these technologies where their destructive uses, I believe, are maximized to gain an edge. That would be a very, very dangerous territory. And one point of agreement, with Dr. Sethi is on outsourcing escalation control during crisis and too much reliance on third party. There was also a question by somebody in the audience asking about what complicates the, deterrence dynamics during a crisis. And I think Pakistan and India need to have bilateral escalation control mechanisms that would stay put during a crisis as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabia. I'm going to go to Adil next. So thank you, Adil. Is the SPD or the NCA, in your experience, is it an oasis of calm? Can it be isolated from public opinion?
I'll not comment on the SPD. I think what Rabia said, I think that's very rational thing. And that's how the institutions, once you have institutionalized command and control, so you keep those institutions insulated from such kind of public debate where it starts to affect. So, but since I'm not representing SPD, so I won't comment on that. But your broader questions, these two questions, and some of the comments that I would quickly like to address. Now, there was a comment made about cold start, why cold start started because of terrorism. So one has to go back to the genesis of terrorism. Because if we see 2019, the person who blew himself up, the way he was humiliated by Indian security forces, and it was a reaction, what is happening in Kashmir. So that was, that led to something which generated that crisis. So one has to go back to that genesis. Even if we talk about terrorism, so then one also wonders, should terrorists be allowed to influence the behavior of nuclear weapon states? Because then what is happening in Pakistan, what has been happening, and Indian senior leadership has been claiming their role in Balochistan and other parts of the country. So should Pakistan also be behaving the way Indian leadership behave? I don't think so. So we have to be very careful that we are nuclear weapon states. So as nuclear weapon states, you don't let the terrorists guide your behavior. On talking about the tactical nuclear weapons, I think what Dr. Rabia also clarified, I would also like to state this notion that has been taken from Cold War, it is applied differently in South Asia. So the short-range ballistic missiles, the whole purpose as part of the full spectrum deterrence was to prevent war. So the objective is strategic. So yes, these are short-range ballistic missiles. And why there is merit at times to label them as tactical, because you want to bring that clarity of communication to the adversary that these are against specific threats, but you are achieving that strategic objective of preventing a crisis or a war that can escalate to an all-out war between two nuclear armed adversaries. So there's merit also by sometimes labeling them as tactical, but we have to be very, very clear that the purpose is strategic. I know the time is short, so I'll just refer to on the last comment that was made about that Balakot exposed Pakistan's full spectrum deterrence. We as nuclear strategists or scholars or analysts, we know nuclear weapons are not a panacea for all kind of issues. That means something, a firecracker goes onto the other side and we start hurling nuclear threat. No, this is not how we have understood a nuclear deterrence. Nuclear deterrence has a very specific purpose, and once it is used for that specific purpose, only then it is seen as credible. The way Prime Minister Modi hurled that threat against Pakistan, nobody took it as credible even in Pakistan and even in India, because it was out of context. So he was trying to play that in domestic constituency to build his nationalist credentials. It was not a real threat. So if you start threatening everything with nuclear weapons or nuclear deterrence, the credibility of your nuclear deterrence gets diluted. So we have to be very careful. Balakot was a lesson that Pakistan's full spectrum deterrence has worked, and it will work in the future also. But it would be irresponsible to assume that anything that happens on the other side, Pakistan will come up with its nuclear response. That is not we have stated, and I don't think so that's the correct understanding of Pakistan's full spectrum deterrence posture. Thank you.
Thank you, Adil. Rukmani, I know we're running out of time, but do you have any quick comments before we went to the poll?
I have a lot of questions rather than comments, really, because I want to actually understand this, and maybe we can't address it during this discussion, but the use of Nasr to avoid a round of escalation. So this is what I understood from the last few comments. So Pakistan does believe in escalation for de-escalation. Is that correct? And the other question...
I would sorry, just in the interest of time, because I know this is going to go into another cycle. It's not to invalidate your questions, so sorry. But perhaps you can follow those up later rather than embarking on a new round.
Absolutely. So we can move on to the poll.
Thank you. So I know there are lots of questions, which is the sign of a good discussion, but I am aware of the time element. So if I could just go to the last poll. Thank you, and apologies for the noise in my neighbour's garden. And it focuses a little bit on the commitment trap, which we've alluded to. But in your opinion, as the audience, does rhetoric create a commitment trap that can drive escalation?
While we're waiting for the poll, actually, I have a quick question. When we're talking about the idea that public opinion is not influencing decision-making in Pakistan, do you think it is a sort of contradiction to then expect plaudits for alleged conflict de-escalation by Pakistan or terminating conflict.
That could be true on both sides, but I will go to the poll questions, and thank you, Rukmani. So I ended it there. Thank you all, and thank you for the audience. So I think perhaps there's a perception that rhetoric does create a commitment trap, and from my understanding, that would begin at the conventional level, and the need for a firm response, resolve through whatever provocation, with perhaps elements of escalation there. So thank you so much to all of our speakers. I know we have run over time, so thank you all. And I had to skip a question, but that was really interesting debate. Zenobia, I know you've been keeping an eye on the Q&A. Did you have any final comments or thoughts from that before we close this session?
Yeah, so we've been getting loads of questions, and we didn't plan 3 hours for this event because we know no one wants to sit at their computer for so long, but that's probably the time we need to talk about these. So what I've done is I've collected all of them in a Word document under different categories, and they will be shared with all the panelists after this. And as we've been talking, I've been sharing some of the questions with them as well. So I hope that a lot of you have found some answers, actually, if you were still here and still listening, because we've been incorporating the questions in what we're saying. But we'll get back to them in more detail. I've divided them into the section on sort of numbers and arms race, where people had questions about whether deterrence is more complex in the South Asia context. There were a fair few comments on emerging technology as well and the role that plays in the deterrence discussion. I have a whole section on China as well, of course. There is an entire page of questions when we were discussing the credible minimum deterrence, minimum credible deterrence situation. And I will also share a couple of articles for people who are less familiar with these kind of terms, because in the strategic community, this is what we talk about a lot, and that's one of the reasons we're having this discussion to make sure that we know what we're talking about. But I know if you have come from elsewhere, if you are a reporter reporting on this newly, or a student who's taking a class on this recently, then yeah, I'll share some articles introducing all these terms a little bit. I've also got a section of questions on escalation and limited conflict with some really great comments like, are there chances of limited war between India and Pakistan? And then I had a lot on this last section we were just talking about as well, on rhetoric, on different statements that have been made and what the impact of that could be, who understands that in what way. So yeah, as I said, I've collected all of them, and I am sorry I haven't been able to weave them in a little bit more organically by speaking out more. But I hope you will all feel heard, because we've made note of this and the panelists have been reading them, and this has been very interesting for us. So I apologize that's a little bit one-sided right now, but that does bring me to the slide we're on right now. This is part of a wider project where we've been interviewing people, and we wanted to have this event to talk about these subjects a little bit more in detail following the interviews. But we're also designing this survey, as I mentioned, which will be another opportunity for you to share your thoughts. And then what will happen with all this is we're going to be writing a report on it, and it's going to be openly published on the CSSS website very soon, actually, this summer, if all goes to plan. So we can see, you know, there was a lot of interest in this, if we might have more events like this, if we can have another discussion like this, and how we can further interact about these topics on Twitter, on LinkedIn, via email, via private conversations. We are very keen to stay in touch with everyone to keep talking about this. Yeah, any final comments from you, Karl?
No, just a thank you to all of our panelists. I think we've had a very engaging debate and discussion on some key themes. We're very keen to keep the conversation going. So really at this stage, just say thank you to all of our panelists for joining us and for the patience, because we're 20 minutes over now, and but everyone is busy. So thank you so much. So really, at this point, just to say thank you to our panelists. We have Dr. Rabia Akhtar, Dr. Adil Sultan, Dr. Manpreet Sethi, and Ms. Rukmani Gupta. We'd love to actually have a quick catch up and call with you afterwards. But for now, I would just like to say thank you to the audience. Thank you to our panelists and to the support team here who have helped make this possible. But thank you, everyone. And we look forward to hearing more from you soon. So thank you from me, and goodbye.